But the fates had, I believe, already decreed the origin of this great city and the foundation of the mightiest empire under heaven. The tradition goes on to say that after the floating cradle in which the boys Remus and Romulus had been exposed had been left by the retreating water on dry land, a thirsty she-wolf from the surrounding hills, attracted by the crying of the children, came to them, gave them her teats to suck, and was so gentle towards them that the king's flockmaster found her licking the boys with her tongue. According to the story, his name was Faustulus. He took the children to his hut and gave them to his wife Larentia to bring up. It is said that the festival of the Lupercalia, which is still observed, was even in those days celebrated on the Palatine Hill. The existence of this festival was widely recognized, and it was while the two brothers were engaged in it that the brigands ambushed them. Romulus successfully defended himself, but Remus was taken prisoner. Romulus shrunk from a direct attack, for he was no match for the king in open fight. They were instructed to approach the palace by different routes and meet there at a given time. The attack succeeded, and the king was killed. The young men marched in order through the midst of the assembly and saluted their grandfather as king. Their action was approved by the whole population, who with one voice ratified the title and sovereignty of the king. These pleasant anticipations were disturbed by the ancestral curse, ambition. As they were twins and no claim to precedence could be based on seniority, they decided to consult the tutelary deities of the place by means of augury, as to who was to give his name to the new city, and who was to rule it after it had been founded. Romulus accordingly selected the Palatine for his station for observation, and Remus the Aventine. Each was saluted as king by his own party. The one side based their claim on the priority of the appearance, and the other on the number of the birds. Then followed an angry altercation. Heated passions led to bloodshed, and in the tumult Remus was killed. Romulus thus became sole ruler, and the city was called after him, its founder. This is how the legendary ancient Rome was founded. Or, at least it was, according to Titus Livius in his seminal work Ab Urbe Condita, which translates to something like "since the founding of the city." Now, I've cut out some of the more obscure and referential parts of the story, but the important bit to remember is that this is the story that the Romans themselves believed. It was a story that the Romans told and retold themselves countless times through generations and centuries before writing it down in the form that we know today. According to this myth, Romulus, as in the one the city of Roma is named after, and his twin brother Remus were floated down a river as infants, rescued by a wolf, and raised by a shepherd. As some ancient historians and scholars pointed out, even at the time, the word that the Romans used for a she-wolf, lupa, being the feminine version of the Latin word for wolf, which is lupus, was also the word that the Romans used for prostitutes. Now, you would think that the most logical way to interpret that would then be that the twin brothers were rescued by a prostitute who heard crying children by the river and nurtured them. Or, alternatively, you can believe that it was a literal wolf, an animal consistently equated with ferocity and danger in antiquity, that rescued the twin brothers and raised them until they were rescued by the shepherd Faustulus. Who knows, maybe someone just called Romulus a son of a bitch and things snowballed from there. But what we do know is which version of the story the Romans believed. There are even some rather gruesome stories about Romulus skinning the wolf that had saved his life and wearing its pelt around his head and shoulders. The Romans honored this mythical wolf on the Lupercalia, the religious festival that celebrated the founding of Rome and the twin brothers Remus and Romulus, even though, curiously enough, Lupercalia seems to have been celebrated long before the twin brothers themselves were even born. And, perhaps even more importantly than that, Lupercalia was celebrated by Romans in the Roman empire after the alleged fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. So let's then take the Romans at face value and explore that further and examine this myth and how it relates to the tradition and celebration of Lupercalia. The purpose of this video is then to try to get to the truth behind the mythical founding of Rome and what made Lupercalia, the undisputed favorite Roman holiday, so special that people celebrated it in all its mythical glory uninterruptedly for more than 1,000 years. This myth of the twin-suckling she-wolf is still very much alive and kicking, by the way, some 2,773 years after Romulus is supposed to have founded the city. It can be seen all over the modern city of Rome, and perhaps most famously of all as the logo of AS Roma, who play in the Olympic Stadium in Rome. Despite the modern image of Rome being most commonly associated with the imperial eagle, the wolf was the signature animal of the Romans for more than 650 years. Now, 650 years is an almost incomprehensibly long time, especially when you factor in that it hasn't been a thing for more than 2,000 years. But just to put that into perspective, the wolf was the signature animal of the Romans and signified them for more than twice as long as Great Britain has even existed. Now, this all changed in the 1st century BCE, when Gaius Marius, the man who raised Julius Caesar after the death of his father, made his signature animal, the eagle, the standard insignia of the Roman legions to foster a sense of unity rather than competition between them. But that is a video in and of itself for a later time. Young and poor Romans trying to make a name for themselves in the legions would sign up to serve as the very front line of the Roman military as the so-called velites, who were the Roman skirmishing unit. Now, if you don't know what skirmishers are, it's just jargon that meant that they threw their spears at the enemy's front line and then ran away when the people in armor showed up. Now, these velites would, much like the mythical version of Romulus, wear wolf pelts to battle. Now, they did this both for protection, because a wolf's pelt is better than nothing if you can't afford armor, but also to distinguish themselves for bravery in battle and recognized as such by their superior officers. Now, I can explain all of that in more detail, but it may be better to think about it in these terms. The Roman Republican legion from around 323 to 107 BCE, these numbers are never exact, worked essentially like a pyramid scheme. The rich kept getting richer and the poor kept getting poorer. The way that it worked was that the legion was split into 5 groups based off of one's social status, or perhaps more appropriately, one's social caste. And service in the legions was seen as the prerequisite stepping stone to a life in politics. And one could not become a politician without first serving in the legions. Service in the legions being a stepping stone to politics is still a thing within living memory, by the way. This was most famously of all the case in the United States of America, where from 1945 to the end of the 20th century, Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, and both George Bush and George W. Bush had all been members of the American Legion before becoming president. And of these, the standout, John F. Kennedy, famously breaking down religious barriers when he became the first Roman Catholic president of the United States. But I will cover all of that in due detail in due time. So, returning to the topic at hand. At the top of the Republican Legion sat the landed aristocracy and knights, which also happened to make up around 99.97% of Rome's political class. The knights were responsible for the legion's cavalry, and unlike in the infantry, which was 20 years of service, 10 years in the cavalry counted as having fulfilled your military service to the state. As such, the rich had a huge advantage not only in terms of survival, but in terms of political activity. If you were twice as likely to die and have half the time to make political connection, by the very nature and definition of the system, those who were already on the inside stayed on the inside, and those who were on the outside needed exceptional talent, a small fortune, and powerful backers just to make it over the threshold. The reason that I call this essentially a pyramid scheme was because not only were those at the higher level of society much better trained and much better equipped, they wouldn't even come into contact with the enemy until after the enemy had made their way through an entire line of skirmishers, the aforementioned wolf-clad velites. Now, this may seem like an irrelevant part of the story, some quirk or an eccentric habit of a long ago faded civilization. But it is an incredibly important part of the Roman military and their military doctrine, which, let us not forget, included a lot of religious elements and strict adherence to social status. Just to try to sum up what a truly unfathomable and, let's be honest, weird thing this was, for a longer period of time than most modern nation states have even existed, Rome fought no war without first engaging their enemy in battle with thousands upon thousands of soldiers dressed up like wolves inspired by the mythical Romulus. But the myth of the wolf that raised Remus and Romulus was most significantly in Roman culture, seen through the aforementioned pagan religious festival of Lupercalia. As I alluded to this festival in my last video about the history of domestication of cats and dogs, I will now get into the details of this festival. The historical and factual Lupercalia was the oldest continual annual religious festival that the Romans had, and was the most popular and beloved religious festival in all of Roman history. It took place in the middle of February and marked the beginning of spring and the hope of new life. Now, I've covered in detail in another one of my earlier videos, but the Roman calendar was anything but uniform and was wildly inconsistent in length. Now, this was partially down to ignorance in the earlier times, but this was done for purely cynical political purposes by the time of Julius Caesar, and this was the reason that Caesar instituted the Julian calendar, which has stood unchanged as the building block of our calendar for the last 2065 years. It's also worth noting in this context that for a period of around 600 years, traditionally given as 753 to 153, it was the month of March and not January that was the first month of the Roman calendar. But before Caesar, or rather Caesar's astronomer Sosigenes of Alexandria, whom he borrowed from his mistress Cleopatra, before they fixed the dysfunctional Roman calendar, the Roman year was not uniform in length. And so, whenever a conservative held the consulship, the year would coincidentally be longer. And when the conservatives lost the election to consul, the year would magically be made shorter by Rome's hereditary high priests, who were responsible for maintaining the calendar and informing the people. Now, these days that they took from the end of year would then be magically added back to the calendar whenever their allies were back in power. But I left this part out of my video on the calendar for the purposes of covering it here. Due to this nature, the Festival of Lupercalia became the equivalent of what we in the modern Gregorian calendar imagine with New Year's Eve on December 31st every year. Lupercalia was by design one huge celebration. Winter was almost over, the snows were melting, spring was in the air, and people needed to blow off some steam. During Lupercalia, men would draw a woman's name from an amphora to be their date and accompany them for the duration of the Lupercalia festival. In many cases, these Lupercalia couples, for the lack of a better word, would stay together until the following year's festival, and we are even told that many fell in love and married, and considering that this was a fertility festival, may have been the entire point of the exercise. I realize that oldest is a very relative term that changes depending on whichever two times you are comparing, and doesn't really tell you all that much as a standalone statement. The oldest member in your family is likely a grandparent or even a great-grandparent, but even if the oldest person that you know was the oldest person on the planet, that's still only around 120 years. Lupercalia, on the other hand, was celebrated for at least 1,200 years on record in the West, around 1,500 years if you include the East, but probably much longer than that in secret. To put this in fixed relative terms that may help you understand the cultural significance of Lupercalia and what it actually means when I say the oldest continual annual tradition, Lupercalia was such an ancient religious festival that when it was celebrated at the end of Rome's alleged Golden Age, during the reign of the Emperor Commodus, whom you may recognize from hilariously inaccurate, if very entertaining movie Gladiator, but during the reign of Commodus, it was as ancient a tradition to the ancient Romans of Commodus's age as the Crusades are to you and me now. And not only that, if there was an equivalent tradition to Lupercalia that was celebrated unchanged for that amount of time, it would have needed to start during the Crusades, and counting from today would need to be celebrated for another period of time that's longer than Great Britain has existed, just to be on the same footing as the tradition of Lupercalia. You may also recognize Lupercalia due to its theatrical importance as the time that William Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar begins on. Or, in the modernized Christian world, by what it was replaced by, St. Valentine's Day, which takes place on the 14th of February only, compared to the original 3-day Roman festival. The highly mythologized Lupercal cave, where the ceremonial part of Lupercalia took place, was for centuries believed to have been just that, a mythical place. Or alternatively, it had existed millennia ago, but it would have been ruined by an invading army or converted during the Christianization of pagan Rome. But most interestingly enough, the Lupercal cave was actually found as late as in the year 2007, marking a significant leap forward in terms of historical and archaeological evidence corroborating the same story and making it already one of the most important and significant archaeological discoveries of the 21st century. Lupercalia rituals, though, did not exclusively take place in the Lupercal cave, but it also took place in the Roman public meeting place called the Comitium, which was essentially the political and religious part of the Roman Forum. The festival began in the Lupercal cave with the sacrifice of male goats, a representation of sexuality, and a dog, which some sources specify had to be a puppy. In all of their religious animal sacrifices, and there are a near ludicrous amount of them, Romans, unlike almost all other cultures of the time, as referenced by almost all ancient sources, did not sacrifice dogs. They sacrificed just about every other animal on the planet for just about every reason under the stars, but Lupercalia stands as a standalone exception to this rule. The always entertaining, if somewhat unreliable, Lucius Mestrius Plutarchus, wrote an extensive piece on Greek and Roman customs. Apart from being one of our main sources on anything and everything to do with Julius Caesar, he is also the main author of the Spartan myth, which you can still see is very much alive in movies like 300, and bizarrely enough, in contemporary American politics, the least Spartan society on the planet. Now, Plutarchus also wrote an entire piece where he ruthlessly rips into the so-called father of history, Herodotus, whom I mentioned in my last video. And this piece of writing is believed by many scholars to be the first recorded case of a scathing review in Western history. Even though, ironically enough, Plutarchus is guilty of all the same short-sighted biases he accuses Herodotus of possessing. But in one of his lesser-known works, Plutarchus wrote something which is today known colloquially by the Latin translation Questiones Romani, even though the original title may be translated as something slightly less formal, along the lines of reasons that Romans do things. And Plutarchus lists a whopping 113 of them. Most of them are fascinating, many of them are utterly bizarre or flat out wrong, but included in these 113 customs was the Roman celebration of Lupercalia, the fertility festival celebrating the founding of the city of Rome and paying dues to the wolf that saved the twin brothers, without whom there would be no Rome, and therefore no Roman Republic, and by extension no Greek-speaking Roman Empire for Plutarchus to have been born into. Why do the Luperci sacrifice a dog? The Luperci are men who race through the city on the Lupercalia, lightly clad in loincloths, striking those whom they meet with a strip of leather. Is it because this performance constitutes a rite of purification of the city? In fact, they call this month February, and indeed this very day, Februata, and to strike with a kind of leather thong they call Februari, the word meaning to purify. Or is it that Lupus means wolf, and the Lupercalia is the wolf festival, and that the dog is the natural enemy of the wolf, and for this reason is sacrificed at the wolf festival? Or is it that the dogs bark at the Luperci and annoy them as they race about in the city? Or is it that the sacrifice is made to Pan, and the dog is something dear to Pan because of his herd of goats? The Lupercalia sacrifices were performed by the Luperci, or Wolf Brothers, a group of hereditary Roman priests descended from the twin brothers Remus and Romulus. Afterwards, the foreheads of two naked Luperci were smeared with the blood of the sacrificial animals, using the still bloody sacrificial knife. The blood was then removed from their foreheads with a piece of milk-soaked wool, as the Luperci brothers laughed, which all of our sources stress to be a very important aspect of the religious ceremony. Now, Lupercalia did have some religious role. It served as a celebration to the lesser-known Roman god Lupercus, the god of farmers, shepherds, and wild animals. Lupercus is, as you can probably tell, the god who gave his name to the festival, as the god who helped the wolf help Romulus and Remus, a deus et lupus ex machina, if you will. But the Romans celebrated Lupercalia in the month of Februarius, named after the Roman god of purification, and where we get modern-day name for the month of February, meaning that February was literally called the cleaning or purging month. And another unrelated but somewhat interesting fact nonetheless, the Roman word for fever is febre, and if you've ever been told that you look feverish, that comes directly from the same source as the month of February. You know, the more you know. I mentioned that the priests sacrificed goats, and the Romans being Romans, letting nothing go to waste that could be used. These are, after all, the people who used cow intestines fermented in urine to put out fires. But if you thought that was weird enough, this is where things get really weird. The Romans made a feast for the whole city using 2 goats. That these 2 goats were meant to be enough to feed the whole community should also give us a bit of an insight into just how old and unmovable this tradition was. But more than that, after they feasted on these goats, they made their hides into whips, and in later, more prudish times, into loincloths. And this seems to have been the main attraction of the entire festival. These aristocratic young men, whose families seem to have either obligatorily or voluntarily supplied the feast with free or cheap wine, would run through the streets of Rome. As I said, later sources say that they were wearing loincloths, but others say that they would run through the street butt naked. According to legend, each hit from the whip of the sacrificial animals was supposed to bring with them the blessing of fortune and fertility, to bring their own children forth, like the gods had granted the wolf that suckled Remus and Romulus. And so, during Lupercalia, these drunk aristocrats, using these goat whips, would run around and try to hit young women of all social classes who, for the sake of piety, had to pretend that they weren't deliberately trying to increase their chances of getting pregnant. Which just makes perfect sense when you think about it. Because if there is one thing that encapsulates survival of children and fertility, it's drunk, naked aristocrats running through the streets, hitting people with the recently sacrificed manifestation of a horny goat. Famous Lupercalia in history was in February of the year 44 BCE, when the high priest of Rome and recently made dictator for life, Julius Caesar, added his own family to the, up until that point, monopolized list of Lupercalian priests, got his very distant relative and loyal as a dog co-consul Marcus Antonius to agree to run as one of the Lupercalian priests. Now, not only was Marcus Antonius 39 years old at the time, the antithesis of a young privileged aristocrat, but Antonius owed his entire career and fortune as one of Rome's 2 heads of state to Caesar, and was therefore the perfect candidate for the job. So, when the notoriously unreliable narrator Cicero tells us that Antonius ran naked, oiled, and drunk through the streets of Rome, I feel like we should embrace this anecdote at face value, even if only because the mental image of a Roman consul, the height of the Roman social pyramid, and modern-day equivalent to the President of the United States, running oiled and naked through the city of Rome like an absolute maniac is just too good to pass up. And even though it may not be true, I'm going to include it because the mental image alone is worth it. Also present at this infamous Lupercalia of 44 BCE was Caesar's new matron from another patron, the Hellenic queen and pharaoh of Egypt, Cleopatra, the 7th of her name, Theapilopatra, of the formerly Macedonian, now Egyptian, royal house of Ptolemaeus. And this infamously notorious Cleopatra was present when Antonius handed Julius Caesar a diadem, the ultimate taboo of the Roman Republic. Now, just to clarify, a diadem is just a crown, but it was a type of crown almost exclusively worn by Eastern monarchs, including but not limited to Hellenic ones like the aforementioned queen and pharaoh of Egypt. But moving on, Caesar's enemies in the Senate would never let him live this down. The sons of the roughly 11 oligarchical families that had uninterruptedly ruled Rome with an iron fist since before the founding of the Republic, whose fathers and grandfathers had led the Republic to 3 slavery wars, including the one led by the gladiator Spartacus, as well as 2 civil wars and the utter destruction of the Italian peninsula, were very upset with Caesar. They just couldn't take the idea of Caesar establishing a monarchy based on meritocracy in the army and the administration. And worst of all, these aristocratic senators who had ruled Rome at that point for more than 650 years couldn't take the idea of a ruler of Rome being raised by women who held the love of the mob, and they feared that Caesar would bring about the dangerous, bordering on ruinous plans for the Republic of a world where women and poor people would not only be allowed to own property, but would even be listened to in public and be allowed to vote on matters of statecraft. And so it was, a month after Julius Caesar turned down the chance to become king of Rome on Lupercalia, in arguably the most famous murder in the history of Western civilization, the aforementioned mob of entitled senators, who had no plans for how to replace him, nor how to rule the empire in his place, murdered Caesar on the Ides of March for wanting to become king. Okay, whatever. Now this would turn out to be one of the most catastrophically ill thought out plans in world history. Not only did the senators fail to stop Caesar's popular movement, they ushered in the 2,000-year-long Age of Caesar, which I will cover in all its due details at a later time. The Feast of Lupercalia was celebrated by the two families descended from Remus and Romulus, of which Caesar inserted his own Julius family into the mix. And I would like to take a few moments to talk about this further, as I think it is an incredibly telling bit of Roman history, considering that Rome is named after the twin murdering Romulus. Now, the really interesting thing about this is that the Quintilia family from Romulus himself didn't really do much. They had a lot of prestige, to be sure, as you would expect from the descendants of Romulus in a society obsessed with legacy as much as the Romans. But as far as important contributions to Roman history go after the days of Romulus, well, they kind of suck at it. In fact, during the entire Republican era, there were only a handful of the Quintilia family who reached the consulship, with more than a 400-year gap between Quintilia consuls. By comparison, the less prestigious Cornelia family, who had a member of the Cornelia family in the office of consul, on average every 10 years for the entirety of the Republican era. And it is perhaps the ultimate bit of irony in the history of Rome that it would be the Fabii family, descended from the murdered twin brother Remus, who would go on to be the powerhouse of Roman politics for another 650 years. With the most famous of these Fabii being Fabius Maximus, the Roman general who saved the state from utter destruction at the hands of Hannibal Barca, and Quintus Fabius Pictor, the first Roman historian, who interestingly enough wrote the first history of Rome in Greek and not Latin. The only Quintilius of any note was the notoriously unqualified, and the one whose name you may already recognize, Publius Quintilius Varus, who lost 3 entire legions in one day at the Teutoburg forest, causing the Romans to forever abandon the region of Germania. As Suetonius tells us, the Emperor Augustus was informed of Varus's defeat, I quote, "In short, we are informed that the emperor was in such a troubled state that for several days he let the hair of his head and beard grow, and sometimes knocked his head against the doorposts, crying out, 'O Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions.'" Now, fast forwarding forward from the time of the Emperor Augustus to the reign of the Emperor Constantine. In the early 4th century, a man known to history simply as Constantine the Great officially became Caesar. Now, Constantine took the pivotal and history-shaping decision to move the capital of the Roman Empire, founded and named after Romulus more than 1,000 years earlier, to his newly founded city of Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul in modern-day Turkey, where the Roman Empire would continue to thrive for more than 1,000 years after the reign of Constantine, until it ultimately fell to the Osmanic Empire under the command of Mehmed the Conqueror in the year 1453 CE. Constantine was therefore not only the pivotal figure in moving the Roman Empire from the place it was literally named after, but as I covered in much more detail in my video on the history of the calendar, Constantine was the figure single-handedly most responsible for the transition of the traditionally pagan religion of the Roman Empire being converted into the monotheistic religion of Christianity that we are all familiar with today. And so it came to be that the Wolf Festival of Romulus, founder of pagan Rome, was celebrated in a Christian Roman Empire nowhere near the city of Rome and the Lupercal cave after which the festival was named. It was then in the fully Christianized Roman Empire that the Festival of Lupercalia, as the most beloved of pagan festivals, was replaced by the Christian Saint Valentine's Day, which remains to this very day, albeit in unrecognizable form from its earlier times, and can barely be counted as the same tradition barring its still relevant name. Lupercalia became a fertility festival over time, but it started as a tradition by the descendants of the twin brothers Romulus and Remus. Two men were chosen from Rome's hereditary exclusive class of Luperci priests to represent the twins Remus and Romulus, to use the Roman order, and complete the ritual. After the sacrifice of the goats and the dog was finished, the sacrificial knife, still dripping with the blood of the sacrificed animals, was wiped on their foreheads and immediately washed off by the aforementioned priest. The symbolism is simple and very strong. Sometimes blood gets spilled, but if at the end of it both sides have enough milk that they can use milk instead of water to clean blood with, all can be forgiven. It's not exactly the most complex and layered of messages, but at the same time it's also very hard to get wrong if you're trying to do the same tradition for 1.5 millennia. And keeping it simple is also important, especially because you can't have an ancient religious festival without a lot of wine. And if the history of antiquity teaches us one thing and one thing only, it's that nothing says love of the gods like getting stupidly drunk and misbehaving. And so, by definition, there was a lot of drinking involved with the Festival of Lupercalia. And let us again not forget that this tradition was started by the descendants of twin brothers, where one murdered the other, just after endangering the entire community to rescue him from the king they went and killed together. And so, getting together and drinking together was a symbolic and healing gesture extended by both sides of the family tree. When I originally sat down to record this episode about Lupercalia and the importance of the wolf in Roman culture, I accidentally ended up making an entire documentary about the domestication of cats and dogs, where I cover this in much more detail, which you can watch by watching the pop-up link here or by clicking the link in the description below. But for those who haven't seen it, the sacrifice of a dog is significant for two very specific reasons. The Romans never sacrificed dogs and considered it a barbaric act and one that separated them and their religion from their neighbors and barbarians. Barbarians just being the word for anyone non-Roman. Secondly, this was a significant exception done by Rome's exclusive class of Luperci priests, and one that was needed to be representative of the mythical wolf without whom there would be no Rome. My personal guess is that at some point too many people either died or got injured trying to catch your wolf pups that they just substituted them with dogs, and at some point no one wanted to be the first to volunteer doing it the old-fashioned way again. I vaguely hinted at the possibility that Lupercalia may have been an even earlier Greek tradition that the Romans straight up stole and made their own. We can base this on the similarities between a number of myths. For example, we know that when Zeus, the Greek king of the gods, was born, he too was hidden away in a cave to be free from his father, who wants him dead, was nursed by an animal, even though some sources say that he was found by a nymph who fed him the milk of a goat, which, has to be said, bears an awfully striking similarity to the story of the later deified Romulus. But even if it isn't stolen from Greek tradition, Lupercalia is an absolutely fascinating festival and tradition for what it represented in ancient Rome, but also for how harshly the Christianized Roman Empire cracked down on this then most hated of pagan tradition. It was replaced by the incredibly tame by comparison St. Valentine's Day, which has since been even further removed into the commercialized Valentine's Day, which straight up cuts out the saintly part of St. Valentine's Day, which is not only significantly less interesting, but only lasts one day compared to the previous 3-day extravagant celebrations that the Romans and inhabitants of the Roman sphere of influence had come to expect. At the end of the day, though, Lupercalia poses quite a conundrum. It was celebrated by Romans, celebrating the foundation and founding of Rome, and yet we still teach in schools and universities and beyond that Rome either fell in the year 410 or 476, depending on where you were raised in the Western world, and how much the country you live in now wants to try to claim credit for it for its own political purposes. But the facts remain, several centuries after the alleged fall of the Roman Empire, and again I cannot stress this enough, Lupercalia was celebrated by people who called themselves, and arguably more importantly than that, were referred to as such by everyone around them, as Romans for longer after the alleged fall of Rome than most member states of the United Nations have existed as a concept. Now this raises the fundamental question: why do we have centuries of evidence of people who were Romans and celebrated the founding of Rome if, as we are told and taught, that Romans no longer existed? The most logical answer to that question must then be that the Roman Empire didn't end in the 5th century CE, but carried on for almost 1,000 years in the much more strategically and commercially important city of Constantinople. Almost as if the Rome that started out as a series of 7 connected hills in the middle of what we now refer to as the Italian peninsula, and went on to encompass every strip of land surrounding the Mediterranean Sea, it's almost as if it wasn't defined to the original 7 hills that the city was founded on. And furthermore, if Romulus had A, the know-how to build a city like Constantinople, he would have. B, if he had known that Constantinople even existed, he would have almost certainly have picked its location for the founding of a city. And C, Romulus wouldn't have done this because he didn't have the faintest idea of what the Romans would do for centuries and millennia after he died. Because the Roman Republic never existed in the romanticized version that it is portrayed as today. And the reason for that is that Rome, since its very inception, was a shared idea and not a location. Though I am sure that Roman high priests and devoutly religious Romans would probably disagree with me if they could. But even the ancient term for republic, res publica, literally means the public thing, or in other translations, commonwealth, not republic. And this is a direct reference to the fact that Rome was made up of feuding clans that for most of the Republican era hated the ever-living hell out of each other and spent most of their time scheming and conniving at every step of the way. And the Romans didn't really have a shared identity and culture apart from the one that was centered on war with their neighbors, whose lands, and let us not ignore this key aspect of Roman culture and society, their population as slaves, which they all wanted for themselves more than they currently hated each other. Sometimes in this context helps to think of the Roman Republic and later Empire not as a modern nation-state, but rather more like the world's largest landlocked pirate ship. Think of the Senate as constantly mutinying and fighting against each other, but coming together when under attack from others, or on times when there was a ludicrous amount of loot in it if they would just stick together for one more fight. Rome was a civilization that started with a murder, was cemented and maintained by abduction of women from the neighboring tribe, an event known to history simply as the rape of the Sabine women, which I won't get into more. But you should know that there are, inexplicably to me at least, a truly disturbing amount of paintings and other artworks dedicated to this despicable act. And it cannot be overstated what a monumentally consequential thing this was. The fratricide and the rape were an integral part of Rome's founding myth, and the one that the Romans told themselves and their children as the story of themselves, as who they are, as being the inherited legacy of a brother-killing rapist. And not only was this a good thing in their eyes, but what actually made the Romans superior to others as the apex murderous pillagers of the world. They celebrated this tradition for a conservatively estimated 1,000 years, a quite realistic 1,500 years, and most likely for anywhere between 200 and 400 years longer than that, if we account for the fact that even to this very day, traditions are notoriously difficult and hard to break. And the lack of evidence can also be explained because, as a general rule of thumb, as consistent in the year 521 as in the year 2021, people tend not to leave behind traces written in stone that say things like, "I, insert name, committed blasphemy with my close friends and family at this location, at this date, please come and join us." This isn't conclusive evidence that this didn't happen. Just like selling alcohol and cocaine was illegal in the 20th century United States, didn't stop Al Capone and Pablo Escobar from becoming billionaires, and by extension we can argue banning the Festival of Lupercalia did not mean that it stopped existing. And while it is not my intention to get into that here and now, I would be amiss if I failed to mention the relationship between Romulus and Remus and the biblical figures of Cain and Abel. In my opinion, the true legacy of Lupercalia, and the similarities between the founding story of both Christianity and pagan Rome, beginning with a twin murdering a twin before establishing the one true empire that the world has ever known, is now increasingly hard to ignore. Especially as I have mentioned earlier that starting from the reign of Constantine the Great, Christianity moved to the top of Roman society. Thanks for watching. If you liked what you saw, please leave a like and a comment and consider subscribing, as it helps the channel grow, and feedback from viewers is an integral part of getting better at making videos. I also now have a Patreon account if you want to support the channel, and if you do so, you will get early access to my videos as well as deleted scenes and script notes. This video wasn't all that the Romans had to do with wolves and dogs, and if you want to learn more about that, my last video is dedicated to that, as well as the entire history of the domestication of cats and dogs, and you can watch that by clicking here. Other than that, I hope that you enjoyed it. There are a lot more videos coming up soon, So make sure that you are subscribed, have clicked the bell button to be notified of my next video, and I will see you on the next one. Take care and thanks for watching.